December 20th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The world was white, gray, and red. White from the heaviest snowfall Europe had seen in 20 years. Gray from the leaden sky that grounded the Allied Air Force. And red from the blood of 19,000 American soldiers who were being chewed up by the last, desperate gasp of the Wehrmacht. Adolf Hitler had rolled the dice. He had launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes, a ghost front held by tired American divisions. He had split the Allied line in two. Panic was spreading through the ranks. In the Supreme Headquarters at Versailles, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stared at the map. It was a nightmare. A giant bulge had formed in the line. The Germans were driving for Antwerp. Eisenhower was a pragmatist. He looked at the situation with cold logic. "Bradley is cut off," Eisenhower said, tapping the southern flank of the bulge. "He can't communicate with the 1st and 9th Armies in the north. The phone lines are down. The roads are cut." General Bedell Smith, his chain-smoking chief of staff, nodded grimly. "We need a commander in the north, Ike. Someone to coordinate the defense. Bradley can't do it from Luxembourg." Eisenhower took a drag of his cigarette. He knew what he had to do, and he hated it. "Give it to Monty," Eisenhower said. The room went silent. To give command of 2 American armies, the sheer flower of American military might, to Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery? It was a tactical necessity but a political suicide pill. Montgomery was brilliant, yes, but he was also the most arrogant, difficult, and condescending man in the British Empire. He believed the Americans were amateurs. He believed Eisenhower was a glorified corporate chairman, not a general. "If you give Monty the 1st Army," Bedell Smith warned, "he's going to treat them like colonial troops. Bradley will be furious. Patton will have an aneurysm." "I don't care about their feelings," Eisenhower snapped. "I care about stopping the Germans. Get Monty on the phone." The peacock struts. Montgomery didn't just accept the command. He ascended to it. When the order came through, Montgomery was in his tactical headquarters in the Netherlands. He read the telegram. He didn't see a desperate measure by a frantic Eisenhower. He saw vindication. "I told them," Monty said to his staff, his eyes gleaming. "I told them months ago that their broad front strategy was a disaster. Now the chickens have come home to roost. The Americans have broken. And they have called for the professional to come and save them." He immediately drove to the headquarters of the U.S. First Army. General Courtney Hodges, the American commander, was exhausted. His men were dying in the snow. He didn't need a lecture. He got one anyway. Montgomery strode into the room like a headmaster entering a kindergarten class that had just set fire to the curtains. He refused to look at the map Hodges had prepared. He brought his own map. "This is a shambles," Montgomery declared, waving his hand at the American positions. "Absolute dog's breakfast. You have no reserves. Your lines are too thin. You are fighting in disjointed packets." He looked at the American generals. These were men who had stormed Omaha Beach. Men who had liberated Paris. "You will stop attacking," Montgomery ordered. "You will retreat. You will shorten the line. You will tidy up the battlefield. I will not tolerate this cowboy nonsense of charging blindly into the snow." The Americans were seething, but they obeyed. They were soldiers. The secret telegrams. That night, Montgomery sat down to write to his superiors in London. This is where the poison began to drip. He didn't just report the situation. He framed a narrative. He wrote to Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff in London. The American armies in the north were completely unhinged. They were in a state of confusion. There was no grip, no control. "I have had to take charge of the whole mess. I am tidying it up. The Americans are relieved to finally have someone telling them what to do." It was a lie. The Americans weren't relieved. They were humiliated. They were holding the line with grit and blood, specifically the heroic stand at St. Vith and the Elsenborn Ridge. But Monty didn't see that. He saw only his own genius. He sent another telegram, this one hinting at a darker truth. "Ike is a nice chap, but he has no idea how to fight a battle. We need a single ground commander. Me. If we leave the war to the Americans, they will prolong it by 6 months. London, 10 Downing Street. Winston Churchill sat in his study, wrapped in a silk dressing gown, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The air was thick with cigar smoke. He held the intercept of Monty's telegram. Churchill was a man of words. He knew the power of language, and he knew the fragility of the alliance. He knew that America was the engine winning the war. Britain was the junior partner now, bankrupt and exhausted. They existed only because Roosevelt allowed it. "He is playing with fire," Churchill muttered to his frantic chief of staff, General Ismay. "He is saving the battle, Prime Minister," Ismay argued. "The reports show he has stabilized the northern flank." "He may be winning the battle," Churchill growled, "but he is losing the war. Does he not understand? Ike is not just a general. He is the representative of the United States. If Monty humiliates the U.S. Army, if he calls them useless, Roosevelt will never forgive us." Churchill stood up and paced the room. He looked like a bulldog sensing an intruder. "Montgomery is a great soldier," Churchill said, "but he is a peacock sitting on a stick of dynamite, and he is lighting a match." Churchill drafted a cable to Montgomery. It was polite, but the subtext was screaming. "To Field Marshal Montgomery, congratulations on your swift action, but beware. The Americans are sensitive. Do not let them think you are rubbing their noses in the dirt. We are allies. We swim or sink together." Montgomery read the cable. He crumpled it up. "Winston worries too much," Monty told his aide. "The Americans know they need me. They like a strong hand." January 1945. The turn of the tide. The battle turned. Patton broke through to Bastogne from the south. The weather cleared. American air power returned to the skies. The Germans were crushed. The crisis was over. The Germans were retreating. Eisenhower breathed a sigh of relief. He prepared to return the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies to American command back to Bradley. He wanted to forget the whole embarrassing episode of having to put Americans under British command. But Montgomery wasn't ready to let it go. He wanted credit. He wanted the world to know who had been the savior. He decided to hold a press conference. It would be the most disastrous press conference in military history. January 7, 1945. The schoolhouse. The room was packed with journalists, British and American. Montgomery stood at the front. He looked triumphant. He didn't look like a man who had shared a burden. He looked like a man who had carried a child. "I have called you here," Monty began, his voice high and sharp, "to explain how the battle was won." Back in London, Churchill was listening to the reports coming in over the wire. As he read the transcript of what Monty was saying, his face went pale. "Monty, when I arrived, the situation was a shambles. I employed the whole power of the British Army to save the flank. The Americans were brave, but they needed tidying up. I think this was one of the most tricky battles I have ever handled." Churchill closed his eyes. "He didn't just say he won," Churchill whispered to Ismay. "He said the Americans lost it." The telegrams from Washington started arriving within the hour. They weren't diplomatic. They were incandescent with rage. General Marshall, the highest-ranking American soldier, sent a message to Eisenhower that essentially said, "If you don't shut that man up, I cannot guarantee the cooperation of the United States government." The secret telegrams between Monty and London had been bad. But this was public. Churchill poured himself another brandy. He realized that the German offensive had failed to break the alliance, but Bernard Montgomery might just succeed. "Get me the secure line to the White House," Churchill ordered. "I need to speak to the president before he decides to pull the plug on Europe." But before Churchill could dial, a new message arrived from Versailles. It was from Eisenhower. It wasn't a tactical update. It was a draft letter. Churchill read it. His hand shook. Eisenhower wasn't asking for an apology. He was drafting a letter to the combined chiefs of staff demanding that Montgomery be fired. "The fool," Churchill hissed. "The damned, arrogant fool. He has pushed Ike too far. The stage was set for the showdown. January 8, 1945. 10 Downing Street, London. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 in the morning. Winston Churchill was not sleeping. He was pacing the floor of the cabinet room, his velvet slippers shushing against the carpet. In his hand, he held a sheaf of papers stamped most secret/cipher. These were the intercepts, not German intercepts. These were the private cables sent by Field Marshal Montgomery to Sir Alan Brooke, the head of the British Army. Churchill stopped pacing. He adjusted his glasses and read the lines again, hoping they would change. They didn't. "The Americans," Montgomery had written, "are brave fighting men, but they have no idea of strategy. They are completely out of their depth. Unless I am given full operational command of the ground forces, permanently, we will not win this war in 1945. They are useless at the command level." Useless. There was that word. Useless. Churchill threw the papers onto the table. He turned to General Ismay. "Does he know?" Churchill asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Does he know that Eisenhower reads these? Does he know that Marshall in Washington sees everything?" "Montgomery believes his communications are private, Prime Minister," Ismay said nervously. "Nothing is private," Churchill roared. "We are fighting a global war. The Americans decipher our codes just as we decipher theirs. He is telling the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces that his army is incompetent." Churchill poured a glass of brandy, his hand shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. "I have spent 5 years," Churchill whispered, staring into the amber liquid. 5 years begging Roosevelt for ships, begging for guns, begging for money. I have debased myself. I have courted America like a desperate suitor because I know that without them, Britain is a slave colony of the Third Reich." He took a sip, grimacing. "And now," Churchill continued, "my most famous general is telling the world that the Americans are useless. He is spitting in the face of the giant." The phone rang. It was the secure line from the War Office. "Prime Minister," the voice on the other end said, "we have received a cable from General Eisenhower's headquarters. It is marked, 'Personal and eyes only,' for you." "Read it," Churchill commanded. The voice read the message. It was short. It was brutal. "I can no longer tolerate the atmosphere of criticism and insubordination generated by Field Marshal Montgomery. The time has come to decide who commands this war. It is him or me." Churchill dropped the receiver. It clattered against the wood of the desk. The blood drained from his face. The nightmare scenario had arrived. Eisenhower was demanding a divorce. And if America walked away, if Eisenhower resigned, the alliance would shatter. "Get me Freddie de Gingand," Churchill ordered. "Get him on the phone. Now." Versailles. SHAEF headquarters. While Churchill was panicking in London, the atmosphere in Versailles was freezing. General Major Freddie de Gingand, Montgomery's chief of staff, had just landed. He was the only man in the British Army whom Eisenhower actually liked. He was the oil in the machine, the diplomat who cleaned up Monty's messes. But this mess was too big for a broom. Freddie walked into Ike's office. The air was thick with Camel cigarette smoke. Eisenhower was sitting at his desk, staring at a blank wall. He looked 10 years older than he had a week ago. "General," Freddie said softly. Eisenhower didn't turn. "Freddie, I'm sorry you had to fly in this weather. But it's over." "Sir, surely we can." "No." Eisenhower snapped. He spun his chair around. His eyes were hard. "I've defended him, Freddie, for 2 years. I defended him in Sicily when he stole the road from Patton. I defended him in Normandy when he got stuck at Caen. I gave him the U.S. First Army during the Bulge." Eisenhower picked up a newspaper from his desk. It was the Daily Mail. The headline screamed, "Monty stops the Hun." "He told the press he saved us," Ike said, his voice trembling with suppressed fury. "He made Bradley look like a fool. He made me look like an absentee landlord. And now I hear about these telegrams to London where he calls my command structure useless." Eisenhower opened his desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This is a telegram to the combined chiefs of staff," Eisenhower said. "It says that I cannot work with Montgomery. I am asking to be relieved." Freddie felt his stomach drop. "Sir, if you send that, you know what happens. You are the supreme commander. They won't fire you. They will fire Monty." "That's the point, Freddie," Ike said coldly. "He goes. Today." Freddie de Gingand was a sick man. He had chronic gallstones and was exhausted, but he gathered every ounce of strength he had. "Give me 6 hours," Freddie begged. "Don't send the cable yet. Let me fly to Monty's HQ. Let me show him the cliff he is standing on. If I can't get a full retraction, a full apology, then you can fire him." Eisenhower looked at the clock. He looked at the loyal British officer standing before him. 6 hours, Ike said. "But Freddie, don't let him write a sorry if you were offended note. I want him on his knees. I want him to admit he serves under me. Or he's finished." The flight to Zonhoven. The flight was a suicide run. The fog was so thick the pilot had to fly by following the railway tracks below. Freddie de Gingand sat in the back, shivering, clutching his briefcase. He arrived at Monty's tactical headquarters in Belgium just as the sun was setting. The contrast was jarring. Inside Monty's caravan, the mood was jubilant. The staff officers were laughing, celebrating the victory in the Bulge. They thought the press conference had been a masterstroke. Montgomery was sitting at his table, looking at a portrait of himself that a fan had sent. "Freddie," Monty chirped, "you look dreadful, my dear boy. Are you eating enough?" Freddie didn't answer. He walked over to the table and swept the portrait onto the floor. The room went silent. "Get out," Freddie told the other officers. "Everyone out." When they were alone, Montgomery looked at his chief of staff with a mixture of confusion and irritation. "That was unnecessary, Freddie. What is the matter?" "The matter," Freddie hissed, "is that you are about to be sacked, fired, sent home in disgrace." Montgomery laughed. "Don't be silly. I am the hero of the hour. The British papers are loving it." "The British papers don't run this war," Freddie shouted. "The Americans do. And you have just called the American army useless in front of the world." "I never used that word in the press conference," Monty defended. "You used it in your telegrams to Brooke," Freddie countered. "And Ike knows. Churchill knows. They all know." Freddie opened his briefcase. He pulled out a copy of Eisenhower's draft letter, the one demanding Monty's removal. He slammed it onto the table. "Read it." Montgomery picked up the paper. He put on his spectacles. He read the first line. His smile faded. He read the second line. His hands started to shake. He read the final line. "It is him or me." Montgomery looked up. The arrogance drained out of his face like water from a cracked cup. For the first time, he saw the reality. He wasn't the indispensable genius. He was a subordinate who had pushed his boss too far. He wouldn't send this, Monty stammered. "Ike is a nice chap. We're friends." "He is not your friend right now," Freddie said brutally. "He is a general who has 19,000 dead soldiers, and you just spat on their graves. He is ready to destroy you, Monty, and Churchill won't stop him. I spoke to Downing Street. The Prime Minister is furious. He said you are endangering the Lend-Lease. He said you are biting the hand that feeds us." Montgomery sat down heavily on his bunk. He looked small. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he was naked. "What do I do?" Monty whispered. It was the question of a broken man. "You write," Freddie commanded. "You write a letter to Ike, and you don't lecture him. You don't tell him how to run the war. You apologize. You tell him that he is the boss, and you are his servant. And you do it now. The apology." Montgomery sat at the table. He picked up his fountain pen. He hovered over the paper. For a man with an ego the size of an empire, writing this letter was harder than storming a machine gun nest. It required him to kill the thing he loved most. His own pride. "Dear Ike," he began. He stopped. He looked at Freddie. Freddie nodded sternly. "I am distressed that my press conference has caused offense. I thought I was being helpful. Not good enough, Freddie said from the corner. You have to pledge loyalty. Monty swallowed. He wrote again. I would never do anything to damage the alliance. I am your devoted subordinate. I will serve you in any capacity you see fit. He signed it. B.L. Montgomery. He handed it to Freddie. Will this do? Freddie read it. It was pathetic, submissive, and totally out of character. It might save your neck, Freddie said. I have to fly it back. Tonight. London. The next morning. Freddie didn't just fly to Versailles. He sent a copy to London. Winston Churchill sat in his bed, reading the copy of Monty's apology. He let out a long breath of cigar smoke. He has climbed down, Churchill muttered. Thank God. But Churchill knew that a letter wasn't enough. The damage in Washington was catastrophic. General Marshall was still furious. The American press was running headlines like British general claims U.S. troops failed. Churchill realized he had to intervene personally. He had to perform a public act of contrition to heal the wound that Monty had opened. He called his secretary. Prepare the House of Commons, Churchill said. I am going to make a speech. I am going to talk about the Battle of the Bulge. Are you going to defend the Field Marshal? The secretary asked. Churchill looked out the window at the gray London rain. No, Churchill said. I am going to praise the Americans. I am going to give them the credit they deserve. I am going to make sure the world knows that this was an American victory, paid for with American blood. He paused, his eyes narrowing. And as for Montgomery, I will teach him a lesson in humility that he will never forget. Churchill began to dictate. The United States troops have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses. It is the greatest American battle of the war. He was writing the script that would erase Monty's narrative. He was using his eloquence to bury his own general's ego. But across the ocean, the anger hadn't faded. In the U.S., General George Patton was reading the transcript of Monty's press conference. He threw the paper into the mud. If Ike doesn't fire him, Patton growled to his aide, I'll shoot him myself. The crisis was paused, but it wasn't over. Monty had apologized to Ike, but he hadn't apologized to the men he called useless, and the Americans were not known for forgiving insults easily. Eisenhower held the resignation letter in his hand. Freddie de Guingamp stood before him, exhausted, holding Monty's apology. Ike looked at the apology. Then he looked at the resignation letter. He struck a match. You're a good man, Freddie, Ike said, lighting the corner of the resignation letter. Tell Monty he keeps his job. For now. As the paper burned, curling into black ash, Eisenhower looked up. But tell him one more thing, Ike said. Tell him that if he ever calls my soldiers useless again, I won't write a letter. I'll just send him back to England in a crate. The chamber was packed. The air smelled of damp wool, pipe tobacco, and nervous anticipation. The members of Parliament sat on the green leather benches, murmuring. They knew the rumors. They knew the alliance was cracking. They knew that their most famous general had insulted their most powerful ally. Winston Churchill stood up. He walked to the dispatch box. He was 70 years old, stooped, looking like a tired bulldog who had been fighting for too long. But when he gripped the wooden box, the old fire returned to his eyes. He adjusted his spectacles. He looked around the room. He knew that what he said in the next 10 minutes would determine the future of Anglo-American relations. He began to speak. His voice was a low rumble, rolling through the chamber like distant thunder. I have seen it suggested, Churchill growled, that the British armies played the major part in the recent battle. He paused. In Belgium, listening on the wireless, Montgomery stiffened. That is not true, Churchill declared. A gasp went through the room. A prime minister contradicting his own field marshal in public? The United States troops have done almost all the fighting, Churchill continued, his voice rising. They have suffered almost all the losses. They have held the line at Bastogne and St. Vith. It is the greatest American battle of the war, and it will be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. He wasn't just correcting the record. He was obliterating Montgomery's narrative. He was taking the laurel wreath off Monty's head and placing it squarely on the brow of the American GI. "We must not," Churchill warned, looking directly at the press gallery, "be led into the trap of thinking that we saved the Americans. They saved themselves. And in doing so, they saved us all." When he sat down, the house erupted in cheers. But it wasn't for Monty. It was for the truth. In Washington, President Roosevelt read the transcript. He smiled. He turned to General Marshall. "The old lion can still roar," Roosevelt said. "I think the crisis is over." But in Belgium, Bernard Montgomery switched off the radio. He sat in silence. He had been publicly rebuked by the only man he feared. He realized finally that he was not the star of this show. He was just a supporting actor. February 1945. The Rhine River. The political storm had passed, but the ice on the ground remained. General Omar Bradley returned to command his armies. He was a changed man. The GI's general had lost his patience. He refused to speak to Montgomery unless it was absolutely necessary. When they finally met to plan the crossing of the Rhine, the final barrier into Germany, the meeting was colder than the river itself. Montgomery walked in trying to be charming. He offered Bradley a cigarette, even though he hated smoking. "Brad, my dear fellow," Monty exclaimed. "Ready for the big push?" Bradley didn't smile. He didn't take the cigarette. He looked at Montgomery with eyes like flint. "Let's just look at the map, Field Marshal," Bradley said. Montgomery blinked. He wasn't used to being snubbed. "I say, Brad, are we still worrying about that press conference business? I sent Ike a note. It's all water under the bridge, isn't it?" Bradley leaned over the table. "You called my men useless," Bradley said quietly. "You can apologize to Ike. You can apologize to the Prime Minister. But you can't apologize to the 19,000 men buried in the snow. They can't hear you." Montgomery went silent. He realized that while he had kept his job, he had lost his influence. The Americans would never trust him again. The race to the end. The war moved fast now. The Allies crossed the Rhine. The German army collapsed. But the rivalry didn't end. It intensified. It became a race for Berlin, a race for history. Eisenhower, wary of Montgomery's ego, made a crucial decision. He gave the main thrust of the final offensive not to Monty in the north, but to Bradley in the center. Montgomery was sidelined. He was told to sit on the flank and protect the Americans while they drove into the heart of the Reich. It was the ultimate irony. The man who claimed he had to rescue the Americans was now watching them win the war from the sidelines. And then there was Patton. General George Patton hadn't forgotten the insults either. When he heard that Montgomery was preparing a massive, methodical crossing of the Rhine, with artillery barges and smoke screens, Patton decided to steal the show one last time. Patton drove his Third Army to the river the night before Monty's planned attack. He didn't wait for artillery. He didn't wait for orders. He put his men in boats and rowed across in silence. By the time Montgomery launched his grand assault the next morning, he found Patton already on the other side. Patton stood on the German bank of the Rhine. He unzipped his trousers, and he urinated into the river. "I didn't need a smoke screen," Patton shouted to the wind. "And I didn't need the British to tidy up my mess." It was a crude, vulgar gesture, but it was the American answer to Monty's arrogance. May 1945. The Germans surrender. The war ended in a schoolhouse in Reims, France. The Germans signed the unconditional surrender. Eisenhower sat in his office, drinking champagne from a paper cup. He was exhausted. He had managed the impossible coalition. He had kept the egos from destroying the alliance. Freddie de Gingand, the man who had saved Monty's career, came to visit. "Well, Freddie," Ike said, "we made it." "We did, sir." "You know," Ike said, reflecting, "there were days when fighting the Germans was the easy part. Fighting Monty, that was the real war." "He is a great soldier, sir." Freddie defended his boss one last time. "He is," Ike agreed. "But he's a terrible ally. If we ever have to fight the Russians, Freddie, do me a favor. Keep Monty in London." Epilogue. The verdict of history. Years passed. The generals wrote their memoirs. Eisenhower became president. He became the most powerful man in the world. He rarely spoke of Montgomery. Montgomery became a viscount. He toured schools telling boys how he won the war. But he remained bitter. In his memoirs, he continued to insist that he was right about the bulge, that the Americans were amateurish. But history had a different verdict. When the archives were opened, the secret telegrams were revealed. The world saw the insults. They saw the useless comments. And they saw the draft of the letter Eisenhower almost sent. Historians realized that the Battle of the Bulge wasn't just a military victory. It was a diplomatic miracle. It was the moment when the United States finally stepped out of Britain's shadow and became the undisputed leader of the West. Churchill's speech in the House of Commons marked the passing of the torch. The lion bowed to the eagle. In 1969, shortly before he died, Eisenhower was interviewed. The reporter asked him about the most dangerous moment of the war. Eisenhower didn't talk about D-Day. He didn't talk about the atomic bomb. The most dangerous moment, Eisenhower said, was a snowy day in January 1945, when a British field marshal decided to hold a press conference. Why was it so dangerous? The reporter asked.
Eisenhower smiled. A sad, knowing smile.
Because bullets can kill men, Ike said. But words? Words can kill alliances. And without that alliance, the world would be a very dark place today. He looked at a photo on his desk. It was a picture of him and Churchill laughing. Montgomery was in the background, looking serious, standing alone. We held it together, Ike whispered. Just barely.